In Scotland's Highlands, a team of foresters pulled down thousands of trees in a single winter, not because the land was being cleared for development, not because the timber was needed, because the forest was already dead and the only way to bring it back was to let it fall. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of the Abernathy Reserve, where a radical act of destruction became the most precise act of restoration anyone had attempted in Britain in living memory. Walk into a commercial plantation in the Scottish Highlands, and your first instinct is to relax. Tall trunks, green canopy, soft ground underfoot. It looks like a forest. It sounds like one, if you're lucky enough to catch a breeze, but look closer and something is wrong. Every tree is the same species, every trunk the same age. The canopy above you is a ceiling, not a crown, and the floor beneath you is almost completely silent. No rustling, no foraging, no bird song that wasn't carried in on the wind from somewhere else. This is what ecologists call a monoculture plantation. Trees planted at roughly 3,000 per hectare, packed so tightly that almost no light reaches the ground. The trees race upward, competing for what little sun they can find, and because they grow fast, their trunks and branches stay thin. Too thin to support nests. Too thin to anchor the weight of the animals that once lived here. The forest floor beneath a plantation like this can support almost nothing but moss. No shrubs, no flowering plants, no young trees pushing up through the soil. Just moss and quiet and the eerie order of something that was planted, not grown. Ecologists have a name for this kind of landscape. They call it a green desert. This is the hidden story of the Scottish Highlands. Most visitors see the open moorland and assume it is natural, a vast, ancient emptiness shaped by geology and weather. What they are actually looking at is the scar left by centuries of human activity. 5,000 years ago, these same hills were covered by old-growth forests that stretched from coast to coast. The Caledonian Forest, as it came to be known, sheltered wolves, brown bears, wild horses, and more species of bird and insect than most people can name. It fed entire ecosystems through the logic of complexity, every organism depending on every other in a web so intricate that even today, scientists are still mapping what it contained. Then we dismantled it. Over centuries of grazing, burning, and commercial logging, we stripped the highlands down to something closer to a managed surface than a living system. By the time modern conservation arrived, only around 1% of that ancient Caledonian forest was still standing. 1%. And much of what replaced it was plantation timber, functional, profitable, and ecologically almost worthless. Now, before I go further, there is a larger story behind what happened at Abernathy, the kind of story that includes not just what foresters did in one reserve, but the patterns researchers found in ecosystems across the rewilding world, the cases where this approach worked and the ones where it nearly failed, and what those differences tell us about how recovery actually functions. I couldn't fit all of it into this video. But if you want to go deeper into the species, the timelines, the science, and the field logic, the Rewilding Complete Pack covers exactly that. The link is in the description, and if you're watching on a screen right now, you can scan the QR code, because what comes next at Abernathy is the kind of detail that deserves more than a few minutes. The Abernathy Reserve sits in the Cairngorms of northern Scotland. It holds one of the last surviving fragments of ancient Caledonian pinewood, a remnant, not a reconstruction. And surrounding that remnant, for decades, sat thousands of hectares of commercial plantation, dense, dark, silent plantation. The warden working this land understood something that most people outside the field find deeply counterintuitive. The problem was not simply that the right trees were absent. The problem was that the wrong structure was present, and you cannot plant your way out of a structural problem. A plantation is not a degraded forest waiting to recover. It is a system actively preventing recovery. The canopy blocks the light. The density crowds out the competition. The uniformity eliminates the niches that different species need at different stages of their lives. As long as that structure stands, nothing below it can change. So the team at Abernathy made a decision. that most conservation organizations at the time would not have entertained. They decided to bring the structure down. The method they chose was called winching. A machine anchors to a standing tree and pulls it over at the root. Exactly as a violent North Atlantic storm would, the tree falls. The root plate tears upward, opening a wound in the soil. Light floods into the gap, and the process of succession, the slow, unstoppable reassembly of a living ecosystem begins. They did this to thousands of trees. Year after year, through the winters at Abernathy, they pulled trees down and left them where they fell. The deadwood stayed. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. In a managed forest, fallen timber is removed. It is seen as waste, as a fire risk, as disorder. But in an old-growth system, a fallen tree is not waste, it is infrastructure. A dead trunk lying on the forest floor will, over the course of decades, host hundreds of species of fungi, beetle, and microorganism that could not survive anywhere else. Those organisms feed larger invertebrates, which feed birds, which draw in predators. A single dead tree left in place can support more biological diversity than the living tree above it ever did. The team at Abernathy understood this and let the deadwood accumulate deliberately. They were not mimicking a storm. They were mimicking an entire forest cycle that had been interrupted for generations. And here is where the story stops being beautiful and starts being important. Within months of the first winching operations, the gaps in the canopy began to change. Light reached the forest floor for the first time in decades, and the soil responded. Seeds that had lain dormant, some for years, began to germinate. Juniper pushed through. Birch took hold. Rowan appeared in places where the soil retained enough moisture. The understory, that crucial middle layer between floor and canopy that plantations eliminate entirely, began to reassemble itself from the bottom up. This is the switch metaphor made literal. The seed bank was already there. The soil biology was suppressed but not destroyed. The genetic instructions for the Caledonian Forest were still written into the landscape. The system had not forgotten what it was supposed to be. It had simply been prevented from expressing it. The moment the obstruction was removed, recovery did not need to be engineered. It needed only to be permitted. Research into similar restructuring projects across Northern Europe has found that deadwood-driven regeneration can produce measurable increases in species diversity within as little as 5 years, not the timescales of centuries that conventional forestry assumes. A study published in Forest Ecology and Management found that creating structural diversity through targeted disturbance, including felling and deadwood retention, produced significantly higher invertebrate diversity and understory plant richness than either plantation management or passive rewilding alone. The intervention works because it restores process, not just species. But none of this was guaranteed. The capercaillie is a large, ground-nesting bird, the biggest member of the grouse family, known in older literature as the cock of the woods. It is a species that requires old-growth conditions with a very specific character. Open pine wood with blueberry and other ericaceous shrubs at ground level, enough canopy for shelter, and enough space between the trees for the male's extraordinary display. It is, in other words, a species that a plantation cannot support under any circumstances. And Scotland's capercaillie population has collapsed in a way that is difficult to look at directly. In the last 50 years, numbers fell by 97%. Recent estimates put the surviving population at around 542 individuals, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, 542. There is something about that number that changes how you hear the word. Capercaillie comes from the Scottish Gaelic. Some render it as Coil Mór, the great bird of the forest. The name outlasted the forest itself. It outlasted the conditions that made the bird possible, and now, because of what is happening at places like Abernathy, it may outlast the crisis that nearly ended the species altogether. The work being done there, the winching, the deadwood, the deliberate creation of structural chaos, is designed in part around the needs of the capercaillie. The blueberry regenerates in the light gaps. The pinewood understory reassembles. The space between the trunks opens up. The bird's requirements are not exotic. They are simply the requirements of an intact forest. Give it the forest, and the species follows. What came next was not in anyone's plan. As the restructuring work progressed at Abernathy, the team began to observe effects they had not modeled. The hydrology of the site changed. Where the dense plantation had suppressed ground vegetation and compacted the soil, the opening of the canopy allowed sphagnum moss and bog plants to return to low-lying areas. The soil began to hold water differently. Wetland patches expanded at the forest margins, and with the wetland patches came invertebrates and amphibians that had not been recorded in the area for years, drawn not by any deliberate planting or introduction, but simply by the presence of the right conditions. This is what ecologists mean when they talk about cascading effects. You do not restore a forest by restoring every element of it. You restore the structure, and the structure pulls the rest back through mechanisms you could not predict in advance. The project at Abernathy has committed to restructuring 30 hectares of plantation into wild habitat, a figure that sounds modest until you consider what 30 hectares of restored Caledonian Forest can represent as seed, source, as wildlife corridor, and as proof of concept for every similar site across the Highlands. The foresters who do this work are not unaware of the weight of the time scale they are operating within. A Caledonian pine can live for 300 years. The forests these teams are seeding today will not reach their full character within any living person's memory. The people doing the winching know this. They know they are working for their grandchildren's grandchildren. There is something in that knowledge, not resignation, but a particular kind of patience that I find more courageous than almost any short-term act of conservation I have ever encountered. We did not restore the landscape. We returned the process that knew how, and we stepped back. That is the only honest description of what happens when this kind of work succeeds. The foresters at Abernathy did not build a forest. They removed the obstacle to a forest that was already trying to exist. The seed bank was there, the soil was there. The capercaillie was there barely, 542 individuals clinging to the fragments. The knowledge of what this place was supposed to be was encoded in the organisms that remained. All of it was waiting. All of it needed was structure removed and deadwood left and time allowed to pass. If you have found yourself wondering whether any of this is replicable, whether what happened at Abernathy is a local anomaly or something that could be repeated across the Highlands and beyond, that is exactly the right question to ask. And it is the question I would point you toward the Rewilding Complete Pack to explore fully. The link is in the description, or scan the QR code now if it is on screen. The patterns that determine why some ecosystems recover and others do not are documented there in the kind of depth this video cannot hold. What I can tell you here is this: the Scottish Highlands are not a special case. They are an example of a phenomenon that plays out wherever old-growth systems have been replaced by managed monocultures and wherever someone has been willing to try a different approach. The question is not whether the land can recover. The land almost always can, given the structural conditions for recovery. The question is whether we are willing to see the difference between a forest and something that merely looks like one. There are more stories like this than you would imagine, and I have many more to tell you. If this one stayed with you, if the image of 542 birds holding on in a fragment of the only forest they have ever known means something to you, share it. Leave a comment below about what you think the real barrier is. Is it knowledge? Is it political will? Is it simply that most people still cannot tell the difference between a green desert and a living wood? We didn't restore the landscape. We returned the animal that knew how and stepped back. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.